supposed to look?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Big thing, video conversation series,
Yeah.
engineering logo.
Okay.
Let's talk next generation science standards.
Good.
I suppose I need to know something about those now.
Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you. My name is Shelley Latham. I'm the community manager for linkengineering.org, which is an engineering educators exchange created by the National Academy of Engineering with sponsorship from Chevron. And I would like to welcome you to our video conversation series. Today we are talking all about the next generation science standards with Ted Willard from the National Science Teachers Association. He is a self-proclaimed standards aficionado. So we are in very good hands with Ted. And joining him today is Rachael Manzer, who has worked with the NSTA, helping them curate their NGSS materials and things coming in. And so I'm just going to do a very quick little intro for these two wonderful people who are going to help us figure out the next generation science standards. Ted is the program director of NGSS at NSTA, which is the National Science Teachers Association, and he was involved with the development of next generation science standards and oversaw NSTA's feedback. And he now coordinates NSTA's efforts to support teachers in the implementation of the NGSS. And Rachael Manzer is the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Coordinator for the Winchester Public School District in Connecticut. She's been an educator for 20 years and has worked with every grade level from kindergarten through 12th. And she has also worked at NASA for several years with scientists and astronauts and communicating what they do with educators around the country. She has a wealth of experience in STEM education and in the NGSS. And so Ted is going to start us out with a little primer. Just tell us a little bit about what the next generation science standards are and why they're actually a very cool development in education in this country, if I might editorialize a little bit.
Sure. And so let me get involved here and give you all something to work with here. Hopefully you can now see something on the screen. If you can see, which will show my little bit of geekiness. I like. For any Star Trek aficionados here. But just a real sort of quick going through here, so because we don't know how much any of you all know about the standards that we put together. The standards are really the work of 4 organizations coming together: the National Academies of Science, which is the group behind Link Engineering, an organization called Achieve, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and my own personal favorite for some reason is NSTA. And the standards involved a sort of 2-step process here. The first was to develop the framework for K-12 science education, and that fed into developing the standards. And the standards themselves impact curriculum, instruction, assessment, pre-service education, and professional learning. Almost all aspects of education are affected by standards. So at the start of the framework here, to get a little bit of a sense of this, the framework itself was something that was developed by the National Research Council at the National Academies Press. If you're not familiar with the framework, if you don't have your own copy, I would strongly encourage you to get a copy. You can get a free copy, just like you can from all National Academy publications, by going to the website. And the framework basically took into account all the work that had gone on over the years around standards, some very familiar documents there, and had taken into account the research that had been done. A lot of different National Research Council reports I've got shown there, and pulled that all together. And the big headline around this is this idea of 3-dimensional teaching and learning, that we're taking practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas, and blending them together, integrating them together. And so the practices are really a description of the things that scientists and engineers do in their work. They ask questions, they develop models to find problems, They analyze data, construct explanations, design solutions, and engage in argument from evidence. And so since these are the things that scientists and engineers do, these are the things we want our students to do in their work. And so we basically have students engaging in these practices. We've got disciplinary core ideas in the NGSS. And here too, we'll notice that typical things of life, earth, and physical science are joined by engineering and technology, this idea of engineering design built into it. So these are the ideas that students learn, and broadly listed out here, but then in more detail, you get down to, eventually you can get down to individual goals for each of these areas. And then we have cross-cutting concepts. These are scientific ideas, the scientific concepts, but they're not unique to biology or chemistry or physics or geology or engineering. They cut across, their name, cross-cutting, all of those different disciplines. And so things like patterns or scale, cause and effect, systems, energy and matter, these are broad ideas that apply to all of the sciences, to engineering, and actually many people would say apply to areas beyond the science into other subject areas. And so these three dimensions come together in the framework. Everything I've described so far was outlined in the framework, but that led into the development of standards. And so if we took a look at how those standards come into play, we've got a group of states that came together. There were 26 states across the country that had people engaged in the work. There were 40-some writers stretched across the country who were involved in the standards writing. About half of those people were actually classroom teachers at the time they engaged in it. And they worked on the standards, and the standards came out in 2013. Now we're at the stage where about 19 states in the District of Columbia have actually adopted NGSS. Word for word, they have exactly the same standards in all of those states. Those are in green here on your map. The states in orange are states that ultimately chose to take the framework. Some also made use of NGSS, others didn't, and developed their own state standards. But we can basically say now that over 3/4 of states have standards that are based on the framework, and the same vision of three-dimensional teaching and learning is basically contained from coast to coast. And so I think that, actually, let's go to, I'm going to do a little jump here. I forgot to cut the, actually, let's jump this way here, sorry. So this is what a page of the standards looks like. For those of you who are familiar with the standards, you may remember seeing this for the first time. For those of you who it is the first time, you may be sort of shocked what it looks like. It is not pretty. It's not, it is exactly what I would say you would expect a bunch of scientists and engineers to come up with, because the focus was on how useful is the information to be there. And so if you look at this, it's a little complicated. Well, don't worry, I've got it all fixed for you. There you go. It's all explained. You can just study that and understand all the things in standards. But really the key about this document is more to the point that there are three broad aspects to the standards. There's the aspect of performance expectations that say what we want students to learn. There's the foundation box that gets into, I'm sorry, I say the top piece of performance expectations actually describes what students should be able to do at the end of their learning. This is really designed to guide assessment, what is assessed. The foundation box really gets into details of what the class should focus on in the classroom, the practices, the core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts. And the connection box really explains how this particular part of the standards connects to other parts of the standards or even into standards in other disciplines. And so one last piece here to just give a sense of that. Here's a performance expectation. Here's just taking one of those performance expectations. Develop and use a model to describe how the total number of atoms does not change in a chemical reaction and this mass is conserved. If we imagine a student able to do that, if we had an assessment task, and think about how much nicer a task that would be focused on that would be versus what a lot of state tests have typically focused on. If students are able to do what's described here, that would show us developing and using a model that they can develop a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. So the total number of atoms does not change in a chemical reaction, thus mass is conserved. We have this idea, the total number of, and each type of atom is conserved, and thus mass does not change. And then we've got the idea of mass being conserved. Matter is conserved because atoms are conserved in physical and chemical processes. So this performance expectation really would, a student doing well on this performance expectation would be able to provide evidence that they have the ability to engage in this practice and knowledge of this core idea and this cross-cutting concept. And so that's the real magic of integrating the three dimensions together into performances. And so the goal here is that this is a description of what is to be assessed, not instructional strategies or objectives. Teachers still have a tremendous amount of latitude to figure out how to get kids to this stage. And so that's a very broad and very quick description of what goes on the standard to sort of set us on the same page here. But really all I've talked about is a highly sort of theoretical approach to all of this. I really want to see if Rachel wants to take a moment here and talk about what does that really look like in the classroom.
So welcome everyone. I'm out here in Connecticut, and with NGSS in the classroom, oh man, what I hear from teachers all the time is that they love teaching again. They love teaching as science again. They love teaching in general, because when we're talking about NGSS in the classroom, everything begins with what we call a phenomena. Now, a phenomena is a real world problem that the students are trying to figure out the answer to. And it takes them throughout the unit to be able to do it step by step by step. And all those steps are what's called a storyline. So as the kids are putting pieces together, they are figuring out on their own the science, the engineering, the math, the technology, all behind what that phenomena is. So when you're looking at NGSS in the classroom, what you're going to see is some pretty big conceptual shifts. Shifts like not front-loading vocabulary. The kids figure out the vocabulary, to use the vocabulary throughout the unit when it becomes applicable to what they're studying. It's a shift like not being, the bearer of all information. It is more of the teacher being a guide, a facilitator, as the students try to figure out that problem. Shifts where, nope, we're not going to tell the kids the answers. They have to figure it out, no matter how much they beg and plead. They come up with the answer. Now, we'll give them suggestions and tidbits along the way to help guide them, but we're not going to give them the answer. Or shifts like the importance of discourse in science, where students get together either as a whole group or partners or small groups and be able to talk about what their ideas are. So what you have in the classroom is this, when you have an NGSS unit, is you have this big wealth of excitement. And I can tell you from experience that this excitement doesn't end at the classroom. So I have had numerous parents that get all involved in it and want to figure out the answer too. So it's a really exciting learning community that is all about figuring out real world problems. So I'm going to turn it back over to Shelley and Ted. Ted, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
I'll throw one aspect in here that you've talked about, just to emphasize this point of the shift from learning about ideas in science and engineering to this aspect of figuring out. I used to be a high school physics teacher. And so, back when I was teaching, it would be, here I'm going to show you what some of Newton's laws are. And I'm going to tell you about Newton's first law, or second law, or third law. And then I'm going to show you a phenomena. And you'll see, when you see that phenomena, that I was right as the physics teacher. And so I can pat myself on the head because I understand the physics. But it didn't really require a lot of thinking on the part of the students. But when you make a shift to really focus on the phenomena and give students the phenomena first, like you have a cannon that is being fired, and we have students observe at phenomena and see the cannonball goes flying this way, but also the cannon shifts when that happens. The cannon recoils, it moves when it's fired. And asking students to think about, why does that cannon undergo that movement? And the only way I know to answer that question is by students developing their own understanding of Newton's third law, that when the cannon pushes on the cannonball also has to push on the cannon with the same force. And so if I can get my students to be in the situation that they want to figure out why the cannon moves, I then have my students in the position where they don't know it, but what they want to do is they want to figure out what Newton's third law is. And, let me just say from my own experience as a teacher, most students aren't usually really thinking there, I really want to figure out Newton's third law to begin with. And so that's a major shift of getting students sort of on your side, that their thinking, their interest drives the instruction. And that can be done with a phenomenon that students are trying to figure out. It can also be done with the aspect of a problem to solve. So that cannon being fired, it could be the aspect of how do we get a cannon, how do we make a cannon work of some sort in our classroom, and something spring-loaded, something, an air gun, something like that, that's going to cause the projectile to land in a certain place at a certain time, in a certain way. That's a problem that needs to be solved, and that understanding the science behind things can help solve that problem.
And to piggyback upon what Ted is saying, when students are in the classroom and they are figuring it out, it is really, really powerful. When students have developed their own questions about a phenomena, they are driven to find the answers. When the phenomena is real world and applies to your area or something that's of interest, oh my gosh. Now I can give you many examples at many different grade levels, but I'm going to start off with one, a high school example. So with our high school in our area in Connecticut, we have a new problem to Connecticut called, I'm not going to use the scientific name, I'm going to use the slang name, rock snot. Now, Connecticut is known, one of the things Connecticut is known for is its scenic rivers and its trout fishing. And the phenomena is that what's happening is the rock snot has gotten into a lot of the rivers and is killing off the fish. So with that phenomena, the students had many questions of how did it get there? What is it doing? How is it, how is it changing the ecosystem? How can we stop it? And through this entire unit, they're getting right at the performance expectations, the standards that they need to meet through something that's real life and, applicable to them because it's changing the environment here incredibly. And they're trying to find solutions. They've even offered us some of their solutions to our Department of Environmental Protection. So that's in high school, a high school example. So Shelley, I'm going to turn it to you to see if there are any other questions for the panelists from the.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions just yet, but I would like you both, just because I'm coming from Link Engineering, to talk a little bit about, my understanding is that the NGSS is kind of the first time that engineering has really been a required subject. I mean, not a separate subject perhaps, but something that teachers are expected to teach within these standards at a non-high school level, I should say. And so that's really interesting to me, and I think it's an area of a little bit of sort of confusion and trepidation for a lot of educators who don't understand engineering and who are maybe a little bit intimidated by that aspect of the NGSS. So maybe talk a little bit about how engineering is built into the standards and kind of what that looks like.
Sure. Let me take the first crack of it, and then Rachel can make more sort of classroom applications about that. From the beginning of when the framework was being developed and into the standards, there was this goal to acknowledge that, science and engineering are very tightly connected. The engineering is something that all students need to know something about, and so it should be built into the standards to begin with. And engineering not surprisingly, just as there's science within all three of dimensions, there's engineering playing around in all three dimensions. We have the practices, particularly, asking questions and defining problems, and that defining problems is specifically within engineering. And there's also a practice of constructing explanations and defining solutions. And defining solutions is obviously done. But when you go into the framework, you can actually pull up a page in the framework which has a table which talks about each of the 8 practices in terms of how they apply to science and how they apply to engineering. And that has a great deal of guidance around that. So that's one of the dimensions. We then get into the core ideas, as I mentioned, just as there are specific ideas around, Newton's laws or natural selection or astronomy, there are ideas about engineering going there, primarily about the aspect of engineering design. How does the design process play a role in solving problems? And then even when you go into the standards and you look at the connections box, or you look into the column that's green, that's where the cross-cutting concepts are, you'll also find within that area connections to engineering that talk about the relationship of engineering and science to society and how they relate to each other and how they both have an impact on broader society. So that all of those pieces come together, and engineering is woven throughout all the dimensions. And this plays also in part a big, a critical role in that engineering applications, the education research tends to show, have often connect with much more relevance to students, that gets them involved, gets them wanting to think about learning both the engineering and the science that goes along with that engineering in a way that the sort of more just theoretical of just figuring out how the world works doesn't always apply to students. And so that's my passing the baton to Rachel to make that real.
So I love the engineering piece. And one of the things that's important to note is that when you're talking about engineering is woven into that unit, is woven into that storyline, into those little units. It's not a separate standalone. And that's really important to say. Because with the science, you're using those science terms or information to be able to figure out the engineering. And in the engineering in turn may lead to new science discoveries. So they definitely feed off each other. So a couple things to definitely address is that science and engineering are different. When we're talking about science, we have that phenomena, we're asking questions and we're finding answers to those questions, that explanation piece. With the engineering portion, we have a problem to solve and we have to figure out solutions to those problems. So let me go back to the 2 examples that I gave you, the high school example and both the middle school examples, because both of those had engineering woven within seamlessly. So if we take the middle school example I gave of, why isn't Puerto Rico using solar power to replace the natural hazards, taking out their power system? So what the students had to do is they actually had to, before they came to the final answer, they learned about all those different alternate energy forms, but then they designed a new power system, a power grid for Puerto Rico. So they had to use what they know about the science piece and then apply it to solve the engineering problem, to solve the problem. With the high school, with the rock snot, they had to, once they learned about, how does the rock snot affect the ecosystem? Why are the trout dying? Why is this rock snot living in these cold waters where the trout are, and what's happening to that ecosystem? Once they figured all that out, What they had to do is they had to engineer a solution. How do you stop it? So those engineering pieces go hand in hand with the science. The science is applying the engineering is leading to new science. It's a really exciting part. And I will tell you, when those students are coming up with their solutions to a problem, to a real world problem, the excitement in the classroom is just unbelievable, because they own it. It's theirs, it's their pride, and they can't wait to communicate it and share with others. So the addition of adding engineering to the science standards, meaning the next generation of science standards, has really put in place a higher level of critical thinking skills, because the students have to apply the science they're learning to a real world new situation.
Yeah, it's almost like I've watched engineering challenges in classrooms, and there is a little bit of a sneaky element. It's like the math and the science become important tools to solve the problem, and you're not thinking, oh my gosh, I'm learning a math concept, or oh my gosh, I'm utilizing this science principle, and that is pretty exciting. It's how have you found it in terms of leveling the playing field for students who are maybe intimidated or don't see themselves as mathematicians or scientists, or heaven forbid, engineers?
Well, the engineering piece definitely levels the playing field. There is no doubt about that. So students who may have difficulty with the reading or with the vocabulary or whatever it has, they may be real kinesthetic learners, and by building that solution or designing that solution, they're able to show their understandings in a whole different way. So it's really exciting when you get all these students with all these different possibilities, and being able to apply that information.
I built on that. It's this aspect of creating a very different culture in the classroom. It's this shift from the teacher is just providing information, providing explanations, telling students what the science is, telling students what steps to specifically take, but creating a community in the classroom where all students are encouraged, in fact, required to come up with ideas. They're required to share those ideas. And all ideas have to be ultimately made public. And then this aspect around creating a community and a consensus around these ideas, and working together around the ideas becomes highly important in how things work, and that plays out strongly that we are focused on ideas. We're focused on solving the problem. And when it is the students as a group who are taking a real commitment to planning the learning, that becomes a huge piece.
We do have a question that was sort of echoed by another attendee who's also interested, and that's talking about the SEP of modeling, and I don't even know what that means, so I can't answer that question. Not that anybody thought I would, but I think before the question gets answered, maybe explaining for some of the other people like me who don't know what an SEP of modeling is, and then. Sure. Yeah, especially, and Marjorie's also interested in what that looks like in elementary school.
Fantastic. So we sometimes start throwing around different acronyms for different things. So performance expectation can become PE. Science and engineering practice sometimes becomes SEP. Disciplinary core idea becomes DCI, and cross-cutting concept becomes CCC. So we throw those sort of terms around, and we have, as we've talked about, 8 practices, and One of those is developing and using models. And I'm going to steal the screen here again for a second and bring that into play. And so here is a breakdown of what students are really focused on in developing the practice of developing and using models and what we want to do. And it is one of the ones that probably represents a huge shift for students in really thinking of, and for teachers in thinking about it. Traditionally in classrooms, what do we typically see with models and modeling is we often see a teacher using a model to make an explanation to students. And that's not what we want exactly when it comes to developing and using models, because we want students to be the ones engaging in these practices, not the teachers as the ones engaging in the practices. And I always like to go back to and think about times where maybe I was as a student engaging in modeling. We all can probably remember something in our own education for me it was, make a model of the cell. So for other people, it may be a volcano or the solar system or an atom. And the problem that comes up in that activity as I reflect upon it and as look at it is frequently I was given, what we have is teachers give their students a diagram on a sheet of paper or tell them to look in their textbook, or they tell them to go to some reference material and find an example. And then they duplicate what they see in that diagram in some other medium. Make a poster, do something with 3D, styrofoam balls, whatever it is. And that's not scientific modeling, that's an art project. And I don't mean to discredit art projects. Our projects are really good and valuable in a bunch of different ways, but that's not what we're really looking for when it comes to scientific modeling. What we are looking for here ultimately is a way for students to, in some manner, take the ideas that are in their brain and get them out of their brain into some way that their teacher and their other students can see it. So that it can just be a drawing. If I want to try to draw a model of the water cycle, or I want to draw a model of a cell, or I want to draw a model of what's going on with matter down at the atomic level, those are different things. Or I want to draw a model of how I see something. How does light get to my eye? Or we've got a singer singing a high-pitched note or loudly and it shatters a wine glass. How does that, what is happening there? Can I draw a model that will explain that will convey my ideas about how that's happening? And so what you can see here, and we have for K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, the specific ideas around modeling that we want is that we sometimes want students to develop or use a model to represent amounts, relationships, relative scales. We've got develop a model using analogy or abstract representation, or develop a model to describe or predict phenomena. We've got use or develop a model of a simple system with uncertainty and less predictable factors, or design a test of a model to ascertain its reliability. Use a model to provide mechanistic accounts of phenomena. So these give us a sense of what we're trying to get folks engaging in as a model. Some people will say that the whole purpose of science as an enterprise is this idea of being able to make models of the world, to somehow model a phenomena or use a model to explain a phenomena. F equals ma is essentially a model. So it's a relationship between the force, mass, and acceleration. So all of these different aspects of science are really models. And what we're trying to do is have students engage in model making, because we want them to actually be the ones making sense of the world. And the models are the way that they do that. I'm going to drop the screen, let Rachel talk a little bit, and then I'll throw some more into that.
So regardless of the grade level, modeling is a process. It is not a noun, it is a verb. It is something the students do at the beginning, and it takes them all the way through the end. So when we're looking at modeling, what students are trying to do is they're trying to explain something, put something in some kind of words or pictures or diagrams to try to make sense of what's going on with the phenomenon. So usually with modeling starts in the classroom with what we call an initial model, where either students come together or groups come together and they make an initial model. Now their model may be correct, their model may not be correct, but it's getting their ideas out there. We want to make sure that their ideas are made public. So that way, as an educator, I have an idea of, okay, what misconceptions do they have? Where do they need to go? You know, how do I support them? So throughout the unit, they go back to that model. So they go back, groups go back to that initial model. Now, after they get in going through their storyline, going through those little bits by little bits by little bits, trying to figure it out, every time they figure something out, they have a new thing they can add to their model. So that leads to the very end of the unit when you get to what we call a consensus model, where the entire group agrees for the most part. You may still have a few outliers, but a group comes to consensus of, what is this? We figured it out. How did we get there? Now, from a classroom perspective, I do want to give you a couple words of warning. One is that, yes, modeling is a process, but you can do modeling too much. Usually throughout a classroom unit, I usually go back to a unit, I go back to modeling 3-4 times, usually no more than 4 times, because students can get, no matter what grade level, modeling fatigue, and that they're just, I'm done with modeling. So you don't want to go back too often. That's one of the words of warnings. Second thing I want to let you know is that modeling is probably the most difficult practice, because part of it is because, well, teachers in general aren't aware how to do it. You know, they're used to their solar system models and the cell models and things like that. They're used to those nouns. They're not used to that process. So it takes a little while to develop how to do modeling. And when you jump into modeling, here's another word of caution. Especially middle school, high school level, you're going to see a lot of frustration, especially with the initial model, because students do not want to put their ideas down on paper or wherever it happens to be unless they know it is correct. You know, they'll be asking, Miss, can I use the computer? And you see a cell phone come sneaking out as they're trying to look things up. But that's not what the process is about. So you kind of at the beginning have to reassure them that we're just trying to get the ideas down. So like I mentioned, modeling is a process from initial model all the way to a class consensus model where they agree what that thing is. Now, in those steps between, we talked about storyline and little bits of things, but critical to those steps is discourse, where students get together and they talk about those models. They talk about new pieces to add to their model. And it's through that discourse you'll get to that consensus place. So I hope that helps to clarify a little bit more. Ted, I'm going to throw it over to you for just kind of a brief comment about, yeah, that modeling is one of the more difficult practices.
Yeah. So yeah, a couple of things I'd like to figure out. I think you're right, and so it's one of the more difficult, but it's also one of the most essential. It's one of the ones that when you look at what's gone on in education in the last generation, is least frequently evident in the classroom of doing things. Modeling, explanation, argumentation, those practices that are really involve sense making are often really sort of have been not focused on as much as some of the other practices of like asking questions or analyzing data. A big piece of modeling that I want to put on, and I don't know if Rachel said it explicitly, but she certainly was making reference to it, is this idea of evidence. Is that when students engage in discourse, I've got an idea about here's my model and Rachel has her model, and we are going to agree about some things, we're going to disagree about some things. It then comes down to, what evidence do I have to support that my model is correct versus someone else's? And it's fascinating, even with adults, if you go and ask for evidence to support their model. I mean, to use take a really obvious example here. You know, I think we all on this phone call will probably agree that the Earth is a sphere. What is the evidence you have that the Earth is spherical? What can we pull upon to support that idea? Well, we have pictures of the Earth. Well, the pictures of the Earth really only show one sort of image, and it looks like a circle. How does that support Earth as a sphere? Well, if we have pictures from a lot of different sides, the only shape that always looks like a circle is a sphere. And so there's one piece of evidence. We've got the aspect of a ship going over the horizon, and the issue of seeing that you can still see the very tip of a ship versus other things. We've got the issue of how long does it take a plane to travel from one place to another, very far away. The distances correlate with measuring things out on a globe. They don't fit to measure something out on a flat. And so there's a set of ideas to work with, and you could build that model even farther. Now, students, two other little pieces here to throw in, unless you want to talk specifically about the spherical Earth or that model for a second. Go ahead if you want to, Rachel.
Nope, what I was going to talk about is I was going to definitely say that evidence is crucial. And you know, when you're looking at Common Core, evidence is behind everything that they're doing with Common Core. There's a lot of overlaps. One of the things I do want to address is one of Letty's questions that she had. And her question was that could what the students produce after going through the engineering design process be considered a model? So here's your question to that answer to that question. So it is a model, but it's modeling with a different purpose. So when we're looking at science and we're looking at doing the model, we're trying to model an explanation for a phenomena that is occurring. When we are looking at engineering, yeah, we're doing modeling. Modeling is a process, but the modeling we're doing is to be able to come up with a solution. And we could have a lot of different kinds of models to be able to get to that solution. So that I hope that addresses a little bit of the difference between the two. And Ed, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk a little bit more about that modeling, those points you were going to address.
Yeah, so the evidence piece and the idea of, I loved what you said earlier about that students are going to struggle with, they don't want to put out their ideas at first because they don't think their ideas are going to be right. And we have to get students into a mindset that it's just like we want engineers to be, frequently are used to, is that you're going to be wrong, you're going to have failures. That things are not going to always work out right, and that's okay. That's an essential part of the process. By way of example, let's work with a little bit of a model here. If I, here at a summer in Washington, D.C., take a glass of ice water and take it outside, very shortly after that, I will get little droplets of water on the outside of the glass. If I ask a lot of students, where did that water come from? If I ask adults often where that water comes from, many of them are going to tell me that those water droplets came from the water inside the glass that somehow went through the glass. I'm going to start off in saying that is a fantastic explanation to begin with. They are basically showing an understanding about the conservation of matter. They are saying that they need water to come from someplace. Heck, there's water right there in the middle of the glass. Let's think about using that water. Now, their explanation, as great as I just said it is wrong. Okay, that's not where that water came from, at least not directly. And so what can I do with that? I could go and say, hey kid, you're wrong. But shockingly, research in science education has shown that does not lead to productive learning. Headline there for you. Instead, and this is where phenomena and evidence play into this role here. Imagine I now take a block of steel that I've had in a refrigerator for a couple hours and put it next to that glass. I will find that water droplets form on that cold block of steel as well. So now students who said the water came from the glass, their model which explained the first phenomena does not explain the second phenomena I've presented them. So they now need to make adjustments to their model to work on it. But now they've got the need to make that change based upon additional evidence to work with. And that's exactly what scientists go through and deal with, and the process we want students to go through. And so instead of telling kids what the answer is, we give them situations where they're forced to figure out the answer. We actually push them to learn. And the last aspect about learning, about modeling, I'll sort of throw into this is, if you take nothing else away from this, if you try at some point with your students this school year, those of you in the classroom, have students model a particular phenomenon or situation, try to draw things out to make an explanation at the beginning, middle, and the end of an instructional unit, and see the changes that occur in what they draw. There's nothing I know of that is a more tangible artifact and evidence of students actually learning something than that process.
Letty also had a question just about, and maybe we just touch on it briefly, we've got about 10 minutes left, about the introduction of phenomena to the lower grades, to, K through 3 or 4. And I know that there's a lot of interest and confusion also about how one does engineering with those early grades. And it is remarkable what you can do with those younger kids. Do you want to address that, Rachel? I know you've worked with the younger grades a lot.
I certainly have, and I will tell you something. There is nothing more exciting than seeing those little kids trying to create some kind of solution. Yeah, we have things all over the place, but oh my gosh, the excitement in that room is incredible. So what's cool about the younger grades is that when you're talking about that pre-K through 3, and yeah, older too, is that there is a natural wonder there. There is that natural curiosity there that you can build right off of. The hard part, and I'm going to say this is the hard part for any grade level, is trying to find the phenomena that is relevant and will excite the students. That's the hard part. So when we're talking about that pre-K through 3 realm, I can give you an example of a real world phenomena that's here right in the town of Winchester. So in Winchester in 1955, long time ago, may not be relevant, you think may not be relevant, but basically a flood came through and pretty much wiped out the town. And so part of the 3rd grade standards is looking at natural hazards. And so that's where we began. We began with the flood of 55. And that phenomena, oh my goodness, it was amazing. Because not only were they learning about natural hazards and things, prevention and engineering solutions to the problem, but I was getting emails and phone calls from parents saying, my child took me on a tour downtown and showed me, well, that was a building there, and that building survived the flood. So you have that general excitement. Down in one of the classrooms was doing some phenomena about sound, and well, how does sound waves travel? A parent called me, but they were so excited and so interested in that they took apart the speakers at home to try to figure out how speakers work. So yeah, the parent's like, well, what do I do? This child's now taking apart everything. And I'm like, that is really cool. So if you find that phenomena, which is the hard part, that has that excitement and that interest there, the students are going to take it to places that you never thought they would. And in fact, one of the things as a professional developer and work with developing curriculum, one of the things I do work on with elementary teachers is, because elementary teachers are not always science experts. Well, what happens if some of their questions about this phenomena goes way beyond what I know? And I'm like, it's okay to say, I don't know. Research it together, learn together. Ted, do you want to add anything about early grades phenomena?
Yeah, I think I want to put out, it's this aspect of that sense of wonder that you were talking about and playing around with. And I was looking, just quickly glancing through the standards to try to look at some elementary ideas and hit on some things. Again, my background is in the physical sciences a lot, so I'm working from some things there. But you brought up there's an idea here about things that vibrate make sound and things that make sound vibrate. I brought up earlier this idea of a singer, show a video of a singer breaking a glass with his voice. That is exactly what's going on there. And to understand what's going on there can be an interesting thing for kids to see. And point to an example of that. Another, and I'm not sure what standard it went to, whether it was something in K2 or something in 3.5, but really still at that elementary level to talk about. I have two ice cubes. If I put one on the table and I put the other inside a mitten, which ice cube is going to melt faster and why? Most students will tell you that mittens keep things warm, so the one in the mitten should melt first, and then are somewhat surprised to learn that it actually tends to be the other way. And so something that is part of their world, something that they're familiar with. So the mitten thing might not work in Miami, Florida. It's something that students are interested in. In other parts of the country could play out in a way. And so thinking about their world, looking at the world through their eyes, and then I would really point to looking at what the ideas are that you're trying to focus on, and really think about what's fundamental to those ideas. I'm just glancing here. All animals need food in order to live and grow. They obtain their food from plants or from other animals. I see a lot of kids who are highly interested in animals might want to think about, what do all animals have in common? And I bet you get to them to saying eventually, animals need to eat. What do animals eat? Let's go try to figure out some things about that. Do all animals eat the same thing? So I've got a dog or a cat at home, eats something out of a can, or something out, or something we put in a bowl. Do all animals eat things like that? That may be something that for a child in kindergarten or first grade, that's new, a question they don't know the answer to, and they want to play around with.
So we've got just a few minutes left, and I wanted to get you to maybe just offer some suggestions of for educators who aren't in districts that are providing professional development around these new standards, and for educators who are just interested in adopting this, whether their district is doing it or not. What do you suggest? Like, what are some of the things that they can do to get more of that sort of practical modeling of teaching the NGSS? Suggestions from you about where people can go to?
Rachel, I'm going to let you go first, and I'll come into this because it's really from the classroom perspective, and I've hogged the time most of it.
So the one thing I want to say before I talk about resources is to say try it, and when you try it, don't give up. I will say probably the worst lesson I have ever done was my very first modeling lesson. It was a total disaster. And I learned so much from it and how to do it. So when you're trying it in the classroom, realize that if it doesn't go the way you expect it to go, that doesn't mean that you should stop it and not try again. So some sources that I love. First of all, Ted can talk a lot about National Science Teachers Association and some of our web archives and some of the resources and books they have. I'm going to let him talk more about that. I will tell you, I use them all the time. One of my favorite books that is out there right now, it's like my, I don't go anywhere without it. I even went on vacation with it. My husband's like, no, leave it home. I'm like, no. Is Ambitious Science Teaching. It is tremendous from a classroom application point. Everything we've been talking about here, you're going to find in there. As for myself, Connecticut, we do have some professional development going on, but not enough to reach everyone. And I think that's probably a problem that's happening across everywhere. National Science Teachers Association is one of my first go-tos. because they just have a wealth of high quality information, and Ted can tell you where to go to be able to find those. Ted?
Okay, well, so I'm going to start off with the aspect is the broad idea here is to try to not go this alone. So the first thing would be to try to look and see, do you have someone else in your school that is in the same boat as you are, even if they're teaching a slightly different subject? You know, it doesn't have to be exactly the same thing. If not in your school, in your district, in your town, someplace where you've got someone you can meet for coffee and, you know, complain around and things. That's not the case that everyone has that to work with, but that's a starting point. Then I would point to how we are so blessed to live in the world we live today that is connected by all this interactive technology. Thank engineers yet again. In terms of, you know, you're listening to this video, but there are pieces. There's the Link Engineering website itself is a community to work with that you can go and post questions. You can reach out to people individually or just broadcast a question, and it's meant to be as a community. Within NSTA, we have similar things for science educators. We have listservs for members. We have forums on our website that are freely available to them, whether you're a member or not. And there are, you know, tons of resources. We have a whole subsection of our website that is it's called the NGSS NSTA Hub, which is devoted to supporting teachers around three-dimensional standards and has a wealth of, has anything from classroom resources to guide professional learning. And I'd also do, you know, we have books and then we've got various conferences that NSTA does, so that I would encourage you to go to. Again, to keep in mind that you're part of a community. You are not alone in all of this. But then the other aspect to play on here, just as we said, it's important for for students to feel comfortable with making mistakes. It's important for you all as teachers, as educators, in whatever role, to know you should be trying things out. Some things are going to work great, pat yourself on the back. Some things are not, and that's okay. If you aren't occasionally failing, you're not doing things right. You're not stretching yourself the way that you should be. And so yeah. I encourage you to fail.
I would go so far as to say that one could, if one wanted to practice the engineering design process, you could apply it to the implementation of NGSS in your classroom and really think about what your constraints are and what your, you know, what your resources are and what the problems that you're trying to solve. And failure is a big part of that, as we know. That's how you get better. We are out of time. I want to assure everyone that I will, in a follow-up email, I will provide links to the resources that Rachel and Ted mentioned, and a recording of this will be made available on our website at linkengineering.org. We also have a YouTube channel where we keep all of these recordings there. If you should check it out. I'll send a link to it. This is the 6th of our video conversations that we've had with engineering educators, and they're all very, very helpful and interesting and a lot of fun. This is coming to you from linkengineering.org, which is a project of the National Academy of Engineering and with sponsorship from Chevron. We have lots of resources there. We have a great newsletter that goes out a couple of times a month about engineering education news and things that are going on. And we certainly partner with a lot of organizations, including the National Science Teachers Association, to try to make it easier for educators to start doing engineering with their students. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Rachel.
Just really like to just interject here and just thank everyone for taking the time to do this. And just my major point anytime I talk to teachers is to really point out, say, nothing that I do matters without what you do. So thank you for your work with students.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great rest of the summer. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.